Welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max, and today's episode is called Active Imagination Defined. So over the last couple of years on this channel, a majority of what I've been talking about has been this practice of active imagination. In fact, the majority of videos that I've published have been guided exercises of various kinds, inspired by the major and minor arcana of the tarot and the zodiac signs, as well as the Jungian process of individuation, or at least seeing that process through a Jungian lens. And a little bit over a year ago, I published a video article based on an article I'd already written on makeitconscious.com, and it was called Active Imagination, Exploring the Unconscious Mind. So that was a very brief, I might even say cursory overview, an introduction to this practice of active imagination, and was really intended to serve as a complementary to the guided exercises. And I made a case in that article that there's a place for both guided and unguided practice. The focus at the time was really on producing those exercises, getting people to practice. And I wanted to revisit this because there's so much more to be said on active imagination, not least around where it came from and how to actually do it, but also because I have released a course now to that very end. So I'm releasing a lot of content, not just guided exercises, but also there's the Beyond the Lyman series, which includes a bit of the theory, not just from Jung, but also from several other thinkers as well, relating to the mind, how it works and what we're doing here. But I really think that the idea in general of engaging with yourself, achieving a synthesis between all parts of yourself, is a very, very important practice. Not only a practice, but actually a natural phenomenon, which we'll get into, but it's one that we've sorely lost contact with in our modern age. I mean, in some ways, our modern age is defined by our directedness, as Jung would describe it, our going out to be something, to make something, which is a necessary feature of mind. It's something we do as individuals in our own development, and there's a kind of arc that follows where we start out our life differentiating and then going forth and then becoming a self and trying to fulfill an idea of ourselves, which can always be achieved to some degree, but never wholly, because the idea is not reality. We must actually re-engage those parts of us we've left behind and divest the self from the false trappings of the persona, that's a Jung quote, and the lure of primordial images, i.e. the archetypes. So there's this sort of two-pronged process of integrating the personal aspect and also cultivating a relationship with the wider collective psyche. So in this video here, I'm just going to be giving a potted introduction again to this practice, emphasizing its importance and what some of the next steps are that you can take. There's plenty of free content here, the guided exercise of the course, but it's also important to practice unguided. There's really a place for both. And that was not something I could do justice to in a half-an-hour video. There's actually a full course on that, as I mentioned. It's called How to Talk to Yourself, and it's about 8 hours of content, plus guided exercises, plus quizzes and self-reflection prompts. So there's quite a lot in there. So that's a standalone avenue of exploration if you wish to go that route. But today, let's actually just look at what some of the thinkers have said here. So first to a quote from Robert Johnson. He said in his book Inner Work that active imagination, like the unconscious, has always existed in human life. But as with many facets of our inner life, it took Jung to rediscover the lost art and make it available to modern people. So a number of points to take away from this. What we now call active imagination has always existed. We're going to pin it down with a definition in a few slides' time. But this is not something that Jung invented. Robert Johnson says that he rediscovered it, and we all greatly admire Jung and his work. But Jung himself, actually, in one place it's quite funny, he even credits one of his patients with rediscovering it. Jung had already rediscovered it by this point, but there's a case where he actually just directed a patient of his to go and work on his dreams, and this patient recorded something like 1,500 dreams, and all of his own accord began doing active imagination. He began actually proactively engaging with the images he encountered in these dreams. So it's very much a natural thing that has been happening for as long as humans have existed, because the imagination is an intrinsic part of what it means to be human. The reason being that as creative creatures, the moment we direct our mind in any way at all, we set up necessity and opposites and a kind of contradiction, and we must therefore reconcile with those things to become who we really are in our essence. There's no way around this, and we might spend a large chunk of our lives thinking that we can just make things a certain way, and through our experience of trying that and not so much failing, but having to pick up lessons we didn't expect along the way and ultimately having to confront that which we've left behind, we eventually arrive at this, what I'd call a meta lesson about the very process itself, the very nature of mind itself. So this is not a new thing, but it certainly appears as a rediscovery because it's been we've so lost touch with it in our modern age. There's historical reasons for that as well. None of this is to say that we've completely lost our way exactly, but what humanity has been focused on for the last 300 to 400 years, there's been other needs, there's been other requirements. This has always been important, but in directing our minds towards technology, materialist science, understanding the mechanics of the world in that way, we've largely lost touch with this. And that came about partly as a result of religion reaching its peak in terms of dogmatism. I mean, it was, at least in terms of how it was largely practiced 300-400 years ago, it had kind of run its course in that sense. And you had these various religions butting up against each other and disagreeing and proving each other wrong in a literal sense. And then the need to find some sort of overarching truth that reconciles both. This process of reconciliation is exactly what we're doing inside our own minds when we do active imagination. So I'll just sum up this slide by reflecting on what I see as an incredible differential here. That is, on one hand, the immense benefit of not only this technique or this process, but also inner work in general. Inner work has not really been a popular thing, a very common thing for quite a long time. It's pretty much been the remit of religion, as I said. Not exclusively, obviously. I can hear the comments now that are firing up to disagree. Generally, though, inner work has not been the pervading focus of Western society for quite some time. Of course, there's always been individuals that are much more reflective, but it simply hasn't been the priority. And that's very much changing now. Like, this really is the frontier of our times. It's understanding the mind of psychology, understanding a lot of our problems actually have a psychic cause. So on one hand, there's this great benefit and great power of this technique in particular, which is built on the understanding, aided by Jung. But on the other hand, there's this great lack of knowledge of this technique. There's a huge, wide open opportunity here for all of us to use the techniques that have been taught by those that came before, add our own leaf to the book, sure, but to really use these to understand ourselves in a way that will smooth out our lives and our problems in really a very powerful way. So speaking of the benefits, we're going to move on to discussing those in a moment. But just in summary then, this technique, active imagination, rediscovered by Carl Jung, I would class it as a dedicated practice of inner work. There's many kinds of inner work. In some sense, the very way we carry ourselves, the very way we speak to people, the very kind of work we do, anything we do in the outer world also affects the inner world and can therefore be treated as a kind of inner work. But I add this word here, dedicated. What does it mean to be a dedicated practice of inner work? Well, another way of thinking about that is dedicated introspection, deliberate introversion, anything that involves dedicating all your focus and attention in that moment to working with your inner world in some way. So there's many kinds of this. I talk about this in the 7 habits under habit 7. It includes things like active imagination, meditation, divination arts, qigong, yoga, even dream work you might slot in here somewhere. So active imagination is a meditative kind of dedicated inner work. So it looks a bit like meditation from the outside, and it does have many similarities, but it has some major key differences as well. And as I've added here, it's relatively underutilized and unknown at this time. So over the last 10, 15 years or so, Eastern meditation techniques have become more widely known and widely practiced in the West. aided very much by technology and certain brands and certain apps, like Headspace comes to mind, and a whole bunch of others that then followed as well. So clearly there's an interest in doing inner work, and meditation itself, a very useful technique. I do it, I've been doing it for a long time, and it has many, many benefits. But on its own, it's not a complete practice of dedicated inner work. Often when people meditate, they report encountering entities or beings and visions. And what tends to happen, unfortunately, is that the ego tends to jump on that and believe that they've had this great, well, they probably have had a great revelation, but that it was almost divined or given to them by an external entity of some kind. And who's to say it's not? But you see, this is a very natural human thing. It's no big deal. And I think this is corroborated by the fact that if you intend to have that kind of experience, which you can do in active imagination, once you get familiar with the technique, you can actually replicate that kind of interaction with a near 100% success rate. You can go into your mind, you can plant the seed, and you can have a dialogue with any part of the mind, any part of yourself. And usually it's between the conscious mind, of course, and some part of the unconscious which is in conflict with that and is giving rise to some kind of emotional valence or some kind of emotional tension. And Jung himself was somewhat critical of the adoption of Eastern techniques by Westerners. Times have changed a lot. There's no doubt a lot of benefit in meditation. But as I say, on its own, it's not enough. And it actually also can be used as a bypassing technique of self-hypnosis, which is not going to lead to progress on its own. It may produce the appearance of progress, but there's also this need to engage with deep, contradictory aspects of the unconscious mind, and not just integrate and deepen a relationship with them, but in doing that, come to understand the very nature of mind itself. That is not something you can actually capture in words. Everyone has their way of doing that. Everyone comes to different conclusions about the ultimate nature of mind through doing that. But you see, the very fact that everyone has a different understanding of the mind is in itself pointing to a deeper truth, that this is not something you can capture in words. And the moment we try and do it and say, it's like this and it's not like this, we definitely choose our parents before we're born, or when you have an encounter with this image, that's definitely a past life experience. We make these kinds of judgments. What we're really doing is we're extrapolating our own beliefs into experience. But by encountering lots and lots of different experiences and reconciling the conflicts that arise as a result, even from speaking to different people who all have different beliefs, presumably they believe those things for good reason because they appear to be true in their experience. Well, if we take all that together and try and find the truth that underpins it all, one way or another, this meta lesson we arrive at is that the mind is not something that can be wholly captured in images, in words. And this is actually a large part of the reason why we have to engage with it symbolically. What do we think a symbol is, right? A symbol is, it comes from the Greek word symboline. It means to throw together, to bridge that gap between the conscious stance and the unconscious content, the essence underneath it. So that said, from Jung in The Transcendent Function, in introducing this essay, he said, "The essay may therefore stand with all its imperfections as an historical document. It may give the reader some idea of the efforts of understanding which were needed for the first attempts at a synthetic view of the psychic process in analytical treatment." Okay, let me just explain that. The reason I included that is because I want to set the scene. This particular essay, The Transcendent Function, is relatively short, quite concise, but it provides both a very nice summary of how the mind works in a Jungian sense, as well as the role of active imagination. In fact, the transcendent function originally meant what we now call active imagination. It refers to both the actual function and the technique, so the method and the way the mind works. So we're seeing here an example of how Jung's work actually evolved and how his use of words evolved throughout his career. So with that said, he continues, as its basic argument is still valid today, it may stimulate the reader to a broader and deeper understanding of the problem. This problem is identical with the universal question, how does one come to terms with the unconscious? These are quite strong words. The universal question, how does one come to terms with the unconscious? as he alludes to in the next quote, I think this is the problem, as it were, that we're all facing, and that all traditions, all spiritual traditions are getting at and looking at it in their own way. He says here that this is the question posed by the philosophy of India, and particularly by Buddhism and Zen. Indirectly, it is the fundamental question in practice of all religions and all philosophies. For the unconscious is not this thing or that. It is the unknown, as it immediately affects us. So just to continue on what I was saying earlier, it's not to say that Jung is right about this and everyone else is wrong. That's not what this is saying at all. Jung had by far and away enough wisdom to know that his own words about this were just his own words about it. This is how he saw it. Nonetheless, he is, though, examining not just his own mind, but the beliefs and the teachings of a wide range of different traditions. And through all of this, he arrived at his theories of the unconscious mind and the workings of mind in general. So he's not saying that, haha, I've solved the problem finally, but I think it's very interesting that he's referring to this universal question: how does one come to terms with the unconscious? You know, it's an idea worth testing. How could it not be that? How could anything we do in life not, on some level, be a way of engaging with this problem? Because, as he goes on to say, the unconscious is not this thing or that thing. You know, it's not just merely the mother archetype, or it's not just my wishes and dreams. It is the very unknown as it immediately affects us. So this is all about self-knowledge. It's coming to know what there is. And everything you experience is the self, as I had discussed in last week's video. So everything that we do in a mundane sense, you know, if it's building a business or settling down with family and building a life, whether it's going traveling and building character through those new experiences, discovering aspects of ourselves through these experiences, all of this can actually be construed as a way of confronting the unknown, coming to terms with the unknown. A lot of what we do is about working with that fact that we exist in a great load of mystery. We know very, very little about our existence, or so-called existence. We can know about ourselves, and actually a lot of our attempts to dominate nature or to establish structure, at least in the first half of life, are about maintaining order within that great unknown, and maybe even creating the illusion that we have complete control of it. This is all very necessary because it's all about establishing the I for the purposes of then, or establishing the not I as well for understanding the I. So there's this arc that we follow where initially we're establishing ourselves in the world, and then we're coming to terms with what it is we've pushed out or left behind. This is why it's not merely about making the mind a certain way or making the world a certain way, but rekindling a relationship to mystery itself. Come to understand that the mystery is actually not our enemy, or it's not there to harm us, that actually our very attitude to it creates the danger in large part. Not entirely, because there's also free will that's owned by other people as well, and they can choose to do anything. But as Jung has said in other places, that the mask of the unconscious is not static. And if we approach it with friendliness, that softens its features. And if we approach it with hostility, then it comes back to us with hostility. So having established this universal question and the importance of coming to terms with the unconscious, this is the problem, as he says. Well, the method of active imagination hereinafter described is the most important auxiliary for the production of those contents of the unconscious, which lie, as it were, immediately below the threshold of consciousness, and when intensified, are the most likely to erupt spontaneously into the conscious mind. So having established the problem, he's then talking about one of the solutions, and most notably this very technique. So here we have this, another irony, right? It's the fact that there is this huge problem, like the universal problem, and how much that affects us all, how great a problem that is. And then we have one of the solutions, but the primary solution, and this is corroborated in other things that he said, is this method. Not necessarily his method, but in principle, the idea of engaging with ourselves, of having a conversation with ourselves, of reconciling with those forgotten or not yet realized or disowned aspects of ourselves. And that this is the most important auxiliary for the production of unconscious contents, which lie immediately below the threshold of consciousness. So I'll talk a bit about this in the course as well, how to talk to yourself, because what is immediately below the threshold of consciousness is often of utmost importance. This is what stands to really erupt into our world and take over our mind, maybe in ways that we don't even realize. It's going to lead us to self-sabotage. It's going to lead us to say things which we later regret. This is what's right there calling for our attention. And it shows up in all kinds of manifestations like somatic symptoms, outbursts, aversions, addictions, projections, and not least in our imagination through dreams, spontaneous fantasies, and so on. So there's this immediate content that is asking to be worked with right now. But there's also the deeper aspects, which we can approach more proactively. So these might be our very relationship with the animal or the animus, or the mother or the father archetypes, or the sage archetype, or the trickster, or whatever it might be. Any tarot card you can think of, any zodiac sign you can think of, these are all archetypal images that we each have a relationship to. And we're not looking to bring those wholly into our conscious mind and make them part of us. We're not looking to own them or identify with them. That would be a form of inflation. We're looking to integrate the aspects of those which do pertain to us, but moreover, deepen a relationship with this autonomous collective content. That's key to individuation. It's key to becoming who we really are and living in accordance with our authentic true selves without conflict. So in summary, there is both this responsive use of technique and also the proactive use of this technique. There's using it to deal with whatever's coming up. And there's also the more structured approach of this daily perhaps, or even just regular work on those deep-rooted contents that affect the macro direction of our lives and the kinds of experiences we have. So on one hand, you've got this huge problem. On the other hand, you've got a solution that is nigh on lost in today's world. So a large part of my work is trying to reintroduce this technique, talk about what Jung had to say about it, what his collaborators had to say about it, because Jung is someone that a lot of folks have heard of and respect. He had a huge influence on the direction of philosophy, of psychology, I should say, and philosophy. But here we have one very key aspect of his work, which isn't discussed nearly enough or that frequently. I mean, there are many Jungian analysts who don't use this technique. So when Jung himself is saying that this is the indispensable second part of any analysis that is really meant to go to the roots, how is it that we have Jungian analysts today who are not using this technique? It's very important. And I think one of the reasons is that it's hard, that it involves directly confronting the energetic conflict and resistance in the psyche. You can lie down on your sofa or sit down and you can have the toughest 20 minutes of your life. I know I'm not really selling it to you here, am I? But you see, on the other side of that is this incredible benefit and the release that comes from doing that, and the realignment of yourself, the integration of your character. So if you're not looking to do the work, then it'd be a waste of time unless you were already willing to be responsible and to set your intention to do this and to do inner work. If that's not where your mind is, then okay, nothing I say will either help, or if it does point you in this direction, it won't be very helpful anyway, because it's like building a house on sand. And in fact, we're going to be talking about in a few moments what active imagination is not. Because to really understand something helps you understand what it is not. So just a quote now from Joan Chodorow in her book, Jung on Active Imagination. She said, Jung's therapeutic method had many different names before he settled on the term active imagination. At first, it was the transcendent function. Later, he called it the picture method. Other names were active fantasy and active fantasying. Sometimes the process was referred to as trancing, visioning, exercises, dialectical method, technique of differentiation, technique of introversion, introspection, and technique of the descent. I'll just pause here for a second. What she's getting at here is that, well, firstly, there's many ways in which this can come about. It's not just something you do in a stationary position. Sitting or lying can actually make this very active. You can involve drawing, crafting, making things out of clay. There's many cases of people who do dancing as a way of expressing the conversation. but also here that it's a technique of introversion. So it's this dedicated practice of inner work, but also interestingly, dialectical method. So I want to do a video soon on the relationship between Jung and Hegel. There was no actual relationship because they were alive at different times, but the relationship in their work. Jung came later, of course, and I feel that a lot of his ideas and a lot of his work actually fits very well with Hegel. But if you read what Jung actually said about Hegel, well, it's not much for a start, but whenever he does say something about Hegel, he tends to lean more on criticism. So I think it's quite interesting, and I want to look at the similarities between their work. Anyway, it's interesting here that Jung at one point was considering to call this the dialectical method, because that's exactly what it's about. It's about taking two parts of yourself, conscious stance and an unconscious piece, sometimes multiple unconscious pieces. We see this in Jung's Red Book, where he actually engages with two figures at the same time, and people like Gerhard Dorn as well doing this. There's these two aspects of the unconscious mind which can't get along, and both of which conflict with the conscious stance as well. So the consciousness actually acts as a central hub where these things can come together. And it's about not saying, okay, this one's right, the other one's wrong, or about saying the conscious mind has no idea what it's doing, let's just purely listen, and vice versa. It's not about the conscious mind bulldozing over the unconscious and gaining control over it. It's about understanding the truth to both. That's really what's going on under the hood. It's about reconciling in such a way that the truth that underpins both positions can come to the surface. What appears to be opposite actually contains an underlying unity. This is exactly what I was referring to earlier in the dichotomy between exoteric, absolutist forms of religion and the scientific, materialist worldview that came as a reaction to it. It's not that one is wrong and the other one's right. It's that actually there's now an underlying unity to both. It was necessary to take that swing. And we never lost sight of religion completely, of course. And in other aspects of Jung's work, he talks extensively about how this came about, the impact of it, and what we can do about it. So his work, and a lot of people's work actually, I would include the idealist philosophers like Hegel in this, is in some sense an attempt to reconcile those two positions, discard the falsity on both sides, and understand the truth that underpins them both. And this is exactly what you can do within the parameters of your own mind. Anytime you experience a conflict internally, just as you might get conflict externally between these two camps, these two schools, well, we experience conflict internally as a result of a psychic split. Doesn't mean you've done anything wrong, doesn't mean you're insane, or anything like that. It's actually the function of a perfectly healthy mind. This is what our mind should do. This is the journey. This is the unfolding of spirit. So active imagination is essentially the technique for doing that in a dedicated sense. We're always doing that. We're always doing that through daily life. We're doing it with our words. We're doing it in the way we treat other people around us. We're doing it in our reading and the attitudes we adopt, the way we direct our mind, and all of that. There's nothing in life we do that cannot relate to this in some way. It's all related. But what makes it active imagination is that it is this dedicated practice. So there is no single agreed upon definition, but there is a definition which I use, which was actually formulated by Ken James. So we're going to be getting to that in just a moment. But first, another quote from Chodoro. She said that Jung's analytic method is based on the natural healing function of the imagination. So there are obviously many ways to express it, right? All the creative art psychotherapies, art, dance, music, drama, poetry, as well as sound play, can trace their roots to Jung's early contribution. So this imagination is a perfectly not only natural feature of mind, but it is an intrinsic feature of mind to human beings. And it has a natural healing function. So we ignore it at our peril. God knows there are many people before Jung, countless, who are already talking about this. William Blake comes to mind, a great proponent of the imagination and the power of the imagination and the need to engage with the imagination. So this is by certainly no means a strictly Jungian thing, but he was instrumental in actually shining a light on the need for this in therapy. And as she says here, there are many ways you can do this. I teach a certain technique. I also teach you how you can incorporate other techniques into this. But all of these can be used against the process that I convey in my courses. So just to reiterate the theme here, this is a natural process. And at the same time, it is sorely forgotten in today's world. So therefore, it makes sense to engage with it deliberately, proactively. If we don't, it doesn't eliminate the imagination, it doesn't make it go away. It just constellates it in such a way that it comes out in our daily emotions, the way we feel, the decisions we make, the way we behave, all the way up to the very ways which entire countries treat each other. Things like the breakout of war itself, things like dysfunctional economies, the way we treat our planet. These are all arising as a result of our relationship with ourselves. So, as Jung again says, he reminds us that active imagination is a natural, inborn process, and although it can be taught, it is not so much a technique as it is an inner necessity. So it's something that will happen. The unconscious will exert its influence, whether or not we choose to honor it. And Jung actually said in his own writing, I write about things which actually happen and am not propounding methods of treatment. So even though he did share enough for us to deduce a kind of technique from Jung, he didn't say, okay, this is the way. He didn't even really outline it in a particularly methodical way. Many subsequent thinkers have done that, and I've done that as well in the course, How to Talk to Yourself. But there is no one fixed way, is the point here. This is something that actually happens, and any method is actually a way of facilitating what is already a natural process and working with it, working with nature, effectively. So then let's actually pin it down with a definition. As I mentioned, there is no universal, fixed, agreed upon definition of active imagination. However, Jungian analyst Ken James, I think, offers a very useful one. And this is something he shares in the course on active imagination on Jung platform. So he says, active imagination is the intentional engagement with unconscious material for the purpose of deepening a relationship with that material, enhancing both our intellectual and emotional connection with the unconscious material, and ultimately for deepening our relationship with the unconscious itself. So I like this because it covers all bases and it gives us something to sort of unify our thinking around here. It is the intentional engagement. So we're doing this deliberately, even though it can happen spontaneously. And it would appear that Jung's first ever written account of an active imagination experience was one such case. It sort of just happened to him. The imagination was just crying out for his attention to the point where he couldn't really do anything else. But at that point, he then intentionally engaged with it. So it can be spontaneous, and it's very much natural, but it can nonetheless be intentional as well. So with the unconscious material, for the purpose of deepening a relationship with that material. And this is that dialectical process I talked about. Deepening a relationship really means coming to understand what it is that you each share. It's all you, because if you're engaging with your own mind, but you're also engaging with autonomous collective material, which you view through the lens of your own mind. So in a sense, it's all you. But there's also a distinction between what we call you and the ego and the unconscious material, each of which has value, each of which has a stance. And in doing so, we're enhancing both our emotional and intellectual connection with the material. So a recurring theme amongst many of these thinkers is this need to reconcile various functions of the psyche. And Jung himself was very inspired by Immanuel Kant, who talked about how true knowledge can only arise from the union of these things. He talks about sensing, intuition, intellect. He doesn't talk about feeling, interestingly, but nonetheless, feeling and intellect stand in a kind of opposite here. And actually, true knowledge comes from the union of both. And to understand what a thing is, not least the self, to understand what we are, arises from this integration of the two. This is why I sometimes say that spiritual growth or the process of developing self-knowledge is a two-pronged task of coming to insight on one hand and facing up to feeling on the other. And it's actually that feeling, it's that often that unresolved feeling that leads to certain things being deposited in the personal unconscious for later retrieval and later reconciliation. Once we confront those, we change our meaning to it. It's no longer uncertain. It becomes known, and therefore it's no longer a source of fear. And Ken James then goes on, ultimately, for deepening our relationship with the unconscious itself. And what I take out of this is this notion of rekindling a relationship to mystery itself. Understanding that it's not about imagining figures of light or just dousing everything in conscious awareness and doing away with the bad. Because the moment we view certain aspects of existence as bad, it's no longer an honest or comprehensive pursuit of self-knowledge. Because why does it exist if it's bad? It certainly is bad in some sense, make no mistake. There's many, many bad, undesirable things in this world. There's certainly many harmful things, and there's most certainly the experience of pain and discomfort. And this is not about saying, oh, well, these things aren't bad, really, just forget about them. Of course they're bad. It's just saying that they nonetheless do serve a purpose in existence. They exist for a reason. And in that sense, and this is where we have to kind of be tricky with our words, in that sense, there's a kind of good to them, but it's not what we ordinarily mean by good and bad. They exist for good reason, and they exist in relation to other things. But you see, beyond a point, it's actually our very relationship to these things, understanding our role as a self and also the ego's role within all of this, ultimately to deepen the relationship with the unconscious or the unknown itself. And in the end, that might actually be enough. Of course, there's always more about ourselves to discover as well. But part of that, one of the lessons on the way, is actually discovering that the self includes a lot that's unknown. And that's okay. And actually our own attitude to it plays a pretty significant role in how it appears to us. So it's making friends with mystery. It's understanding that there's no way we can ever know everything, and that's also okay. And it is a journey. The idea is not to complete the journey necessarily. One of the lessons on the journey is to learn that it is a journey. And that's part of the journey itself. So let's, as we come to the end here, just reflect a little bit on what active imagination is not. There's many common misunderstandings. I sometimes see this in comments and sometimes sense it in the way people are engaging with the exercises, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I have to make really clear, though, that active imagination is not merely a visualization or hypnosis, because what this would seem to imply is not necessarily a relationship with the material. Some kind of engagement with it, yes, but not so much a connection. It's more of a kind of power dynamic, because we're saying, okay, I know what I want. I know what is best for me already. And I'm going to get my mind on board to make that happen. The law of attraction comes to mind. The law of manifestation. Yeah, manifestation is a thing. But one of the problems with it is it doesn't adequately consider the laws of compensation and the laws of necessity. So it doesn't necessarily realize that there's actually so much wisdom in the unconscious mind, and it contains the seeds of our development. And that is the universal problem. That is the point, ultimately, is to acquire self-knowledge. So if we're just superimposing something we've already determined to be the point, the goal, and throwing caution to the wind and just saying, well, there's nothing else I need to learn in this. There's nothing else that the unconscious can teach me. I just need to have that car or that lifestyle, and when I get that, I'll be happy. Well, there's something in that that's symbolically valuable and true, but it in itself is not the point. And as we pursue it, we will nonetheless inevitably encounter what we really had to learn along the way. Whether we actually learn it or not is another question, but most certainly it will impose itself on our experience. So in changing our relationship to the unconscious and coming to a basic understanding of the way the mind works, at least, don't have to get super academic about it, but just understanding that there is this unconscious mind and it has a lot of wisdom for us. So it's not about imposing what we already think to be correct on the unconscious mind, so much as it's about opening up a connection with it. And in that way, we can very artfully ebb and flow towards where it is we really need to go. We may have some idea, but we don't always know. Imagine the Fool card from the tarot. He doesn't know where he's going necessarily, and that's also the whole point. So it's not visualization, it's not hypnosis, and neither is it a procedure for manifestation. And in a similar way, it's also not a means of escape or defense against life events. It's actually a way of going towards them. It's a way of confronting the aspects in ourselves which may have given rise to what we encounter. It doesn't bypass or negate what we actually encounter. The need for negation there is a whole other exercise, aided by this very practice, sure, but it's not something we do in active imagination. It's not solipsistic. It's not saying, oh, we just created the situation all by ourselves. But nonetheless, it is coming to terms with the aspects of our minds that did have an influence in its creation or gave rise to its manifestation. Active imagination is not a compensation for dissatisfaction with our circumstances, although what appears may well be compensatory. In other words, it is likely to be antithetical or compensatory to our conscious attitude. So we're not doing it to escape, we're not doing it to make ourselves feel better necessarily, not purely to alleviate the symptoms themselves. However, in addressing the core issue, that will have the effect of alleviating the symptoms. But the point is that we're not engaging with, or we're not rather saying the symptom is the problem, let's just get rid of the symptom. Sure, the symptom is a problem, but it's not the root of a problem. It's actually more accurately described as the manifestation of a deeper essential conflict. That's why these things show up. That's why we have patterns. That's why we have aversions to certain things. It's not the only reason, but it might be why we have an irrational aversion to certain things or a misjudgment of other people. It might be why we get involved in certain addictive patterns as well. So lastly here, it's not spiritual entertainment. It's not a way of bigging yourself up and saying, hey, look, check me out. I'm well good at this active imagination thing. And this is actually one way in which I think it differentiates from Eastern meditation, because by virtue of what it involves, it's a lot harder to become conceited through active imagination, because it's willfully engaging with the unconscious mind. No matter what the conscious intention is, the unconscious will have its own ideas or will operate in its own way, often in a compensatory way. So what might happen is if we approach it with that intention as a way to be better or different or make ourselves look better, a bit like this blinged up guru here seems to be suffering from a case of inflation. If we're approaching it with an inflated attitude, then there's no way getting around the fact that the unconscious will make itself known eventually, sooner or later. In that way, it differentiates itself from meditation, where actually, depending on how you practice meditation, because I make the case that actually a correct practice of meditation is to allow what needs to happen. There's many similarities in that respect, but it can also be used in such a way where actually you're blocking out the unconscious mind, ignoring it or trying to impose your will upon it, cutting off thoughts or trying to stop thoughts. And this is actually not a long-term effective or useful application of meditation, because ultimately it has to involve a reconciliation. Meditation does offer that, but not if its sole purpose is just blocking out what is already there, ignoring it, because the energy of that material has to go somewhere. You cannot create or destroy energy in the psychic sense, just as you can't do so in the physical sense. It's the same principle. So then, if you would like to develop your own practice of active imagination, there's many ways on offer in which you can do that. As I said, I would very much encourage it. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's just a beautiful thing to have in your life. It can really, like a lightning bolt, get to the roots of what it is you're experiencing. I have many clients who sing the praises of this technique and see great results through it. And it's so encouraging to see. It does require effort. It does require dedication, the willingness to take responsibility for the mind. But that in turn is built on an understanding of mind. So it helps to have some idea of the workings of the mind, particularly the unconscious mind. Like I say, though, you don't have to get really scientific about it, just to have some sense of it. So to that end, I have got a couple of playlists you can check out. There's the Beyond the Alignment series. There's a 7-part series. Each one's about 30 or 40 minutes long. It includes a talk and it includes a guided exercise on each episode. So that's really ground zero for developing this practice. If you're not familiar with it, I'd recommend probably starting there. But alternatively, you can also check out the Active Imagination playlist. So there's well over 100 exercises in there you can check out, inspired by various things, including Jungian psychology, shadow work, individuation, but also a lot of those are comprised of the Tarot series and also the Zodiac series. So if you know your zodiac sign, which pretty much everyone does, you can do, for example, your zodiac exercise. If you've got a tarot birth chart from myself, you can do the exercises for your purpose card or your destiny card or any other card that appears in your tarot birth chart. So that's another way you can approach this. And as much as I think guided practice is really beneficial, and I think it has many benefits over even guided meditation practices, I think there's many reasons to do guided active imagination practices. There is also a need for unguided practice. So to that end, there is the course, How to Talk to Yourself. Go check that out. There's a landing page on the new website. So the aim of that course is to get you self-sufficient in this ancient art of active imagination and develop a transformational skill for life. So you can take away, you can do whatever you need to, but to get to this point where whatever it is that's going on for you, because there'll always be something, there'll always be some challenge, I would think, but to give you the confidence to confront those challenges, to confront the universal problem, which is how to come to terms with the unconscious. So this is a powerful way of doing that. According to Jung, it was the primary way of doing that. So what I try to capture in this course is really to get you grounded in that technique. Ultimately, this is a personal journey. It's something that we each have to do on our own. Other people can help us. Other people can share exercises. Other people can share knowledge, their own thoughts, and they can share the thinkers of old. But it has to be you ultimately that discovers yourself, that does your own process of individuation. Each of us, in short, has to do our own philosophy and has to come to terms with ourselves and resolve our conflicts. And as a result, each of us use the benefits of our own work. We are the ones who get to be as we are. We get to live according to our authentic selves. So with that all said, I will thank you all for your time and attention and look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Thank you.